Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to the Family Ministry Podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that I know everybody wants to hear about, and it's volunteers. Recruiting volunteers, leading volunteers. Our guest is Adam Duckworth. Most of you know who Adam is. He and Sue Miller co-authored 2 books, Not Normal, 7 Quirks of Incredible Volunteers, and Leading Not Normal Volunteers. And he talks a little bit about those. But we kind of dive into something they started last year, which is coaching for leaders like you and I as it relates to leading and recruiting volunteers. And so we just talk about what's the coaching like, what are you learning from it, what are people in the group experiencing, what are their barriers, how are they changing, in the 10 weeks that the group exists. So you'll love this conversation. All of us in some way lead and influence volunteers, whether it's directly or through staff or whatever it might be. And so it's really, really helpful. It's a good conversation. We kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on what they talk about in the group, which I think is really helpful. We put all the links and notes that you need in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 79. And that's all I have. So let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Adam. Well, today I'm joined by Adam Duckworth. Welcome to the podcast, Adam.
Hey, Nick. Thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
So for anybody who isn't familiar with you, introduce us to yourself a little bit. Tell us about yourself and your family, your church, what you're up to.
Yeah, sounds good. So, hey guys, my name's Adam Duckworth. I've spent the last 15 years or so, 16 or so now in the church world. Started as a volunteer. Now am a lead communicator. That's kind of code for senior pastor of a church plant. But started in family ministry and became a kids director. Moved to a church in Fort Lauderdale to help them implement the Orange strategy. Became the family ministry lead there. So have just led volunteers for a long time. My wife, Caitlin, is an emergency room trauma nurse down here in Fort Lauderdale. We have a petite golden doodle. Dottie is her name. She's 12 pounds and she's cuter than your dog. I don't want to say it. I don't want to alienate people up front, but if you follow my Instagram, you'll just see it's true. And I apologize for that, but no, she's just really sweet. And we're just loving our life down here. We're really enjoying every day. So that's just a little bit about me.
You, Downtown Harbor Church is a new church plant, right? How old now? 2 years or under that?
Yeah, we are 2 years old. I'll tell you, if I could give anybody a piece of advice, it would be start a church plant. It's the most rewarding thing you'll ever do. And I would also give the piece of advice of don't start a church plant because it's really hard, but it's awesome. No, it's the best thing that I've ever done. It is so rewarding. We meet in a kids science museum. So there is a number of wins yet challenges that go along with that. And we've been just over 2 years old now. There were 18 of us that started, roughly around a couple hundred in attendance now. So it's been a couple of years of growth, which has been interesting and kind of awesome to manage and to meet new people and to just engage with people who don't engage with church or who've been disenfranchised by church. And that's really why we did what we did. So we're about 2 years old. Yeah.
That's awesome. We were a church plant and we're heavily involved in planting new churches in our area. So I definitely have a heart for that. I would agree. If you can do it, do it. But if you're not up for it, I've heard it said before, if you don't think you absolutely need to plant a church, don't, because it's really hard. Right. But you're right. It is the most rewarding thing. And there is really nothing else as impactful in terms of reaching people who are not a part of any church than church planting. So it's so funny because we're talking about just challenges that we faced. Some of our staff was reflecting, and we pull up to this loading dock and there's a lot of rain down here in South Florida and it's been flooded time and time again. We've had to wade with it, on wooden pallets to load our trailer, and then we had to pull up to a different part of the building one time during a monsoon, and a homeless guy almost got into a fight with our executive director. It was just one of these. Nice.
It's been challenge after challenge, but it's been worth it. It's been awesome. So.
Yeah, we joked that if we ever wanted to write a book, you could have helpful principles, but a nice, funny, ridiculous story too. There's enough of those stories that you could tie into some kind of crazy principle, which is great.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you guys are doing that. I've listened to, if anybody hasn't, they should listen to your interview with your executive director on Carrie Newhoff's podcast, right? Where you dove into that experience, which was a lot of fun. But we're going to talk about volunteers because most of the people listening to this podcast either lead volunteers or they lead staff who lead volunteers. And usually, as you know, that's one of the top 2 or 3 challenges ministry leaders face. So before we jump in and talk about it, though, you and Sue Miller have co-authored 2 books, Not Normal Volunteers and Leading Not Normal Volunteers. I'm expecting most people have heard of them, but if not, give us like an overview. What are those books about? How are they different?
Yeah, cool. So about 5 years ago, I started working alongside Sue Miller, and we just started to put our heads together, and we said, there's some interesting stuff out there related to volunteering, but we've yet to see a resource that a leader could pick up and put into the hands of their volunteers to do a number of things. A, help them do what they do better, help them understand the context for actually what they're doing, and help them even appreciate their role or move to a next level in their role. And so what we did is we kind of sat down and we said, hey, what are the most common, most amazing, best traits or principles that we've seen in the best volunteers throughout our career, which was a number of years combined. As you know, Sue has so many years of experience in leading volunteers. And so we just kind of sat down for a couple of days in a room and wrote some stuff on walls and, creative boards and said, what are the best traits or characteristics of the volunteers we've seen? And so we put them in a book called Not Normal, 7 Quirks of Incredible Volunteers. We just kind of came up with those 7 traits or characteristics, and we couldn't call them traits or characteristics. We had to call them quirks because we just think that volunteers are not normal. And that's a very good thing. A lot of people go, isn't that kind of like a backhanded slap at people? No, not at all. We just feel like that's the best phrase that we could describe these people who've chosen to give themselves to a cause bigger than themselves for free. I mean, who does that, right? Because people are just consumed with their own life and their own agenda and going through the motions and day after day. And that's normal. But people who've chosen to sign up to do something different are not normal. And so we've just heard some awesome stories about leaders getting that resource, putting it into the hands of their volunteers. And that's been cool. Subsequently, after that, leaders were approaching us and they're like, hey, we love this. We read this. This is awesome for us. We've given this to our volunteers. How do we help them do this? How do we help them implement what, you guys have written in this book? And so we replied with another resource. And so then we wrote Leading Not Normal Volunteers. And so what we did is we took those 7 quirks and we wrote kind of 5 practicals for each of those quirks that leaders could actually do themselves to implement when they lead volunteers. And so it's been a really cool couple of years of not only traveling around meeting people who have read the resource and engaged with the resource, but who have wanted us to come speak at events and do volunteer trainings and just heard how much it's impacted folks. That has been very humbling because we didn't know that anybody would ever want to listen to us. And sure enough, it was it's been a really cool journey to watch that happen and grow. And we've been very blessed by it and humbled by it. So.
Well, it's a great resource, both books. I know a lot of leaders are doing trainings around it. They're making the book a required reading for volunteers. Or
we like that.
Or they're just infusing it in their volunteer onboarding process, even if they're just taking the principles from it, which is great. I think it's really helpful. And you started, was it last year you started doing coaching?
We did. So what Sue and I, because we just get together so often, we realized that we were both just individually consulting and coaching leaders. And a number of them, people would contact us and they'd say, hey, do you do one-on-one consulting and coaching? And we both were like, yeah, we do that just because we have a heart and passion for leaders. And so what we did is we're like, if we're both doing this, maybe let's put our heads together, take a look at each of our content that we're doing with these leaders and see if we can't develop something that we might put a group of people through who could bounce ideas off of each other, who could have interaction and conversation, who could ask questions, who could share documents with each other based on kind of what we were presenting. And so we came up with this kind of leading volunteers coaching program, which has been really cool. Almost 60 people have gone through it so far, which has been a cool thing for us to see and watch and to interact with folks as they've gone through it. And it was just kind of this organic thing that developed. It was not a plan. It was not something that we set out to do, but we were like, hey, we're both doing this. We should think about if we could train leaders in a different way on a mobile platform. And so we decided to put that together about a year ago, and it's been going very well.
Now, it's for anybody that doesn't know about it, it's basically 10 weeks, right?
Yep.
weekly calls. Yeah. You teach content. Walk us through it a little bit so they know what it looks like.
Yeah, cool. So we developed a 10-week program. So we also realized that leaders' time is really valuable, that you guys who are out there, that you have a limited amount of time because, let's just face it, Sunday is always coming. It's the bottom line in any ministry environment. And for a lot of you, more than Sunday is coming. We are a very simple model. We're really the only thing that we do at Downtown Harbor Church is Sundays, and then we partner with city events. But many churches have events and midweeks and weekends and the whole 9 yards. So we recognized that your time was limited. So we put together this 10-week program for 1 hour a week on the mobile meeting platform called Zoom, where we put together 10 weeks of content that start with how to, recruiting volunteers, owners and renters, coaching structure, wrong fits and what to do, making volunteering fun. There's 10, each week has a topic. So we take an hour a week and we go through each one of those topics. Sue and I will present for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and question and answer. After that, we will interact with each other in our closed Facebook group. So everybody who is a part of the coaching group gets added to the closed Facebook group that we create, and they interact with each other there. Some of them share documents with each other. And if you miss a call, we upload the calls to the coaching group so that people can see what they've missed, because we know people are busy. And then how it starts out is Sue actually gets to spend some one-on-one time with each person on the phone to be able to hear their story, to find out a little bit more about them. And then throughout the entire 10 weeks, and being very honest, after the 10 weeks as well, all of the leaders have kind of 24-hour access to me and Sue for any kind of personal stuff they're dealing with, volunteering stuff they're dealing with, leadership issues they're dealing with. They have our personal cell numbers, email addresses, and it's just a way that we just want to give leaders a sounding board to go, hey, we don't know it all, but we've maybe been a few places that you guys are, and maybe you can lean into us and maybe we can help. And so we've had some amazing conversations. We've had leaders go through transitions. We've had leaders leave jobs, get jobs. We've had leaders who are just entering ministry. We've had leaders who are exiting ministry. We actually had a guy, Nick, who was kind of between jobs and ministry in one of our last coaching groups. And he kind of, through our group, decided that, hey, ministry's not for me. And he took a leading volunteer's job at a local nonprofit instead of being in ministry, which I thought was interesting because it just kind of helped him see some perspective. And not that that was good, bad, or indifferent. It just was interesting. And so I thought that we've had a lot of cool stories like that come out of these groups.
So and obviously the groups, it's a mix of content that's probably not in the books. Some content is from the book, but obviously you're just expanding it. But with all of that, and even some of the things you just mentioned, what do you think has been the most helpful to participants based on their own feedback and what they tell you?
Well, actually, I mean, all of the content is there might be a mention of a couple of things in the book. The only real content that we hammer from the book, just because we found it to be really beneficial, is owners, not renters. But all of it is actually brand new content. We've actually talked about turning it into a book, and then we were like, will that kill our coaching sessions? We're not sure. Yeah. So we're still just tossing what we're going to write next. But the most beneficial thing that we've heard, well, first of all, let me just say a couple of things about this. What I love about the coaching groups is that we found a couple of things. Number one is that no matter whether you are a part of a very small church plant or a huge mega church, the content across the board might be deployed differently, but it is in principle the same. And that's been inspiring to us to hear and to watch, because a lot of people think, oh, I'm just a small church plant, I can't do that. Or I'm a mega church, it doesn't apply to me, the small church stuff. Most of this stuff is kind of applied across the board in terms of leadership, which is what I loved. But the most impactful thing that people take away from the coaching material that we've heard is we spend an entire week on developing what we call a coaching structure. So there are some weeks, this particular week, we spend a full week going through what it looks like, what it means, the vision of it, to develop a coaching structure. And that has been what we've heard is the most impactful thing based on our folks as they leave the coaching time. They've all kind of commented that that's been the most impactful thing.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of them, they created one from scratch. Like they didn't have one and then put it in place kind of thing.
Kind of, yeah. I think a lot of people have heard the word coaching structure and they go, what does that mean? Well, it's basically developing a system, putting a system in place where you have volunteers who are leading a team of volunteers, not staff people, but actual coaches, those who kind of, own and wave the banner for the vision in the ministry with you. And they go ahead and they lead those other volunteers. They are not paid. And some people, it's the first time they've heard it. In fact, most, it's probably the first time they've heard it. But even if people have one in place, they kind of come away with it with fresh ideas or fresh knowledge going, I didn't really think about it that way. Or I had staff kind of doing what coaches do, and I realized that's not what it is. And so that has been the thing that has kind of just been the light bulb for folks as they've gone through this to go, this is something I need to do. And it's all centered in this idea, the coaching structure is all centered in us helping these leaders to understand that if you're going to be a successful leader of volunteers, the best thing that you could ever do is give ministry away. And I think that has been really revolutionary for some and reaffirming for others, because when we get into ministry, we're trained to, put out content, put out events, put out material, the whole 9 yards, and keep doing it and do more and more and more. And if you're not doing more and more and more, then you're really not doing your job. And we just kind of think that the opposite is true. And so, the idea of developing a coaching structure is all about empowering others to lead. And so that's one of the things that we've heard that has been most impactful based on the coaching time that we've spent with these folks.
I'm not surprised, because I feel like that's one of the most common topics or questions I hear about. It's one of the most popular topics on the podcast. When I have guests talk about that, people love that. And I think a lot of people, it's like you're saying, they know of it, but what's probably really helpful in the group is the nuts and bolts. How do I create it from scratch? How do I get it where I want it to actually be? Like that, you don't necessarily hear about a lot anywhere else. And so I'm sure they love that part too. Doing it together. They probably work on it and come back and share ideas and things like that, which is
awesome. And who to go after to be coaches. A lot of people don't really understand or know who to go after to be coaches. And so we try to tell them who to look for as they're searching out these very particular people. In fact, one of the stories that I tell during the coaching time is when I came to Fort Lauderdale and was implementing a coaching structure for the first time. I started to just stand in the hallways and look for people who could potentially be coaches. And there was this one woman who kind of stood out to me. And she was a volunteer who we elevated to be a coach. And she was just very short and found out she was Cuban. So she was originally from Cuba. So she was Cuban. And so she was kind of feisty. I really liked that. I wanted that in a coach. And so I asked her to go out to coffee, and we had a conversation about the vision of what we wanted to do. And I asked her, I said, what did you used to do for a career? Because I knew she was a stay-at-home mom now. And she goes, why? I said, I just have some kind of feeling you were an executive in some way. And that's the kind of person I'm looking for to do this job. Somebody who, doesn't mind making decisions and leading people. And what did you used to do? And she goes, I don't want to tell you. And I said, trust me, nobody is going to be less judgmental than me over what you used to do for a living. So please tell me. And she goes, all right, but you can't tell anybody. And I said, I won't. And I'm not there anymore. So of course now I tell the story. She goes, nice. I used to be an executive for Bacardi. And I said, I knew it. And she ended up, and she was like, well, we were in a Baptist church, and she's like, I don't want that to get out. But she was just kidding, of course. But that was the kind of person I was looking for. I was looking for people who were leaders. I was looking for people who didn't mind making decisions and understood what vision was and understood what leadership was. And here's the truth. Everybody can't be a coach. And a lot of people will just try to fill a hole and plug a leak with someone who is not the right fit. And so we talk about that a lot as well. So
do you find, because again, this is a topic people love to hear about, so I'm sure if we dive down into this a little bit, people will appreciate it. Do you encourage people to get, because I find this a lot too, people get stuck only looking for coaches in their ministry. Like they're looking for people who already serve in a role and then make them a coach, versus a lot of great coaches come from outside your ministry who maybe would never even think about serving in that ministry, except that it's a coach role. Do you find that as well, that you got to push people to look outside their ministry to find coaches?
Yeah. In fact, we encourage people to look in all areas outside your ministry, parents, different departments, in the lot. I mean, it's not just an inside thing, because if you're only looking inside, one of the things that we found is, and insiders weren't bad, but if you were only looking inside, that sometimes you didn't get a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
You didn't get somebody who would, come in with a fresh set of eyes. And for all of us who've been in ministry for an extended period of time, that a fresh set of eyes are so essential to what you're doing week in and week out that you cannot afford to almost go without a fresh set of eyes. So you have to do that.
Yeah. Was there anything in the group so far that's like surprised you? I didn't see that coming, or people ask a lot more about that. I mean, were there any surprises, especially getting into doing the groups and having people talk about it and engage with it each week?
I'm surprised how many people are continually dealing with dysfunctional situations. And it shouldn't surprise me, but it does. And I found that the groups, as much as they're about leading volunteers, because that's the content, what surprised me is how personal we've been able to get with some folks, and help them through transition and help them through churches that are in transition. That wasn't something that I expected going into this. It surprises me, but it doesn't. I mean, I guess I should say it surprises me, but it shouldn't. Yet there are many, many folks who are consistently just churning through dysfunction and trying to lead. I said to a guy who was in one of our coaching groups a couple of months ago, I said, you're wanting to create a volunteer culture in a church that is completely not ready for it, unfortunately. And just helping identify that was important. I said, because you're going to be an island. You're going to be doing this on your own. And it was such a foreign thing. That's something I didn't expect. Now, with that to say, there have been some people who've been in some very functional, amazing situations, but I've been just consistently surprised at the level of dysfunction from senior leadership, in terms of what people consistently deal with. Does that make sense?
Oh, it definitely does. I've been in some mastermind groups where one of them last year in particular, half the group literally, I would not work at their church. Like the dysfunction was so bad. And in fact, two or three of them already aren't working there now, but they stayed longer than I did. Like, a couple of them, you start to hear the story and you think, wow, that's not a good situation. I would not be able to stay there. I'd certainly be looking to move on. And they all were, and I think still are. In fact, I think most of them that are still there, the two or three that are still in their place, are looking, they're working with our friend Jim Weidman to find another fit.
Brother Jimmy. Great.
Yeah, that's right. They should too, and sometimes people don't want to hear that because, it's church. You want to feel like it's family. Sure. We got to fight for it. But I don't know. Sometimes I'm just like, I don't know if I want to give my life to, and the hours and years and all that to a place that's just not going to be healthy. You know what I mean?
I also feel like for some of our folks, they've felt a sense of relief from being kind of released. Even as we've said to them, this is not, maybe you should look for something else. This is a time to maybe move on. I feel like that is just a release of a pressure valve where they go, okay, I might be able to do this for the first time. And so that has been something that I did not expect. I just kind of expected to help people who were leading volunteers. But it's gotten personal, and that's been really cool to watch.
And that's probably been really helpful for them too, more than everything else. Of your groups, I mean, how much is that? Is that a quarter of the group? Is that half the group? How many of the people in the groups are like in a spot like that?
I'd say we're probably dealing with between 25 and 35% of each group that are in a spot like that are going, I'm fighting against the grain. I'm fighting dysfunction. I have this situation that senior leadership won't budge on. Now what do I do? I have one of the common things we hear is my senior leadership will only allow us to have one service. How do I build a culture of volunteering consistently to build a relational model? I mean, there's just a lot of the things that we hear. So I would say about 25 to 35% of us deal with that in any given group.
Yeah. And so people are listening. It's probably similar. There's probably a quarter of folks or more that are listening thinking that might be me. Like I might be in that tough space too.
There's probably 25% of people who are listening who need to find a different job like now.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is
at least probably.
Yeah, probably, which is sometimes hard for people to hear in a church world. Cause again, you think it's family, or I don't know about you, but I find in children's ministry, especially a lot of folks are homegrown. Like they didn't move there for that job. It's their church. They came into it. And so the idea of moving is even more difficult because you're talking about uprooting where you've grown up or where you lived or whatever. So
yeah,
that's
a very true statement. And dare I say, it's one of those things that is maybe more emotional than other areas, as you said, because I mean, even me, my first kids pastor position, I was a volunteer in that position. It was my home church. It was so difficult to leave. And it wasn't even a dysfunctional thing. I mean, I was just doing something different in my career. And so, there is a sense of emotion tied to it for sure.
How about barriers? Because people come in the group, obviously they want to get help recruiting and leading volunteers. And you've probably touched on some of this already, but what are some of the most common barriers you see to people actually recruiting more volunteers, leading better, all of that?
One, service model, first and foremost, which I've already mentioned. Number two, we have just seen that people tend to lead out of desperation and not vision. And that's one of the things that we're writing about now. Me and Sue are writing about that. That's just such a key thing. It's this idea that people go up on stages or look at potential volunteers in the face and they go, "We need you because we have holes." And that is an awful way to recruit people.
Who wants to be a hole? Who wants to fill a hole?
I mean, who wants to go, we just kind of say it like this. When people come up and they go, "Hey, I might be interested in volunteering," that many leaders go, "Oh, thank you so much. You have no idea the things we've been dealing with our 2-year-old room, and we have a hole at the third service, and we've been having a hole for months, and who wants to volunteer for that?"
Yeah, it's like, actually, I just changed my mind. I'm not thinking.
Yeah, I'm not really interested because whoever was here has obviously left for a specific reason. And so what we've kind of encouraged people as they talk about recruiting is to change their language from recruiting from need to recruit to vision. And that's been interesting to watch people make that transition, because there's a big difference when someone is interested in volunteering versus what we just said versus this statement, where someone might go, "I'm glad you're interested in volunteering, because we really believe that the best way for a kid to know God is to know someone who knows God." And not only is that true, but we think it's one of the best things that you could ever do in your life is to give back to a faith community in your church that is partnering alongside families. So we'd love to talk to you about volunteering. There's a huge difference in those statements.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. But one is inviting, one is like, I'm a little worried now.
Yeah. I mean, but the problem is that 95% of leaders are using the desperation, because that's just our nature, because we got to get the schedule filled. We got to fill holes. Somebody's breathing down our neck. And so we've just tried to allow leaders to craft statements, to craft mentalities that would help them lead toward vision and not desperation. We just think that was so key. So
vision, you said the one service, obviously I see that all the time. By the way, I don't know if you've seen this. I don't know if you do. Do you have one service now at Downtown Harbor or two?
No, we started with 2 with 18 people. And nice. I said to our folks, I got to tell you this, Nick, to our folks, I said, how could I be, the guy who believes like I do and not start with 2 services? Because I need our volunteers to be able to have an opportunity to attend church. And dare I say, the first year and a half of that first service, was very, very difficult and brutal, because there was 18 of us who began, and you're dealing with a very low attended empty room. But the volunteers were happy, and they felt like they were cared for and that we cared about them. And so there was a big difference in how they served. And that was important to us. So I always believed in the 2 service thing, always.
We had a different start than most church plants, because we were started by, our pastor came from another church that was a mega church, and he was the student pastor, and we're 10 miles away. So a lot of people came. So our church is not like most. So we had 2 from the beginning, but we've been a part of helping a lot of churches start since then. And we encourage them to do something. It sounds like what you did. I don't know, were both your services public? Like a new person could attend either one, or is it one public and one kind of more just for volunteers?
It was interesting. We started to call our first service the volunteer service, but what we found is that we publicized both of them online. And when new people would come in, they're like, "Oh, this is for volunteers. I can't come." And so we initially branded it as a volunteer service, and they knew it was for them, but we eventually took that branding away.
Yeah, so there was an easy, smooth transition, because we've had some church plants that did that. They started a volunteer service, 30 people, whatever it was, and then they had a regular service, might have 100, 120. And what they would do is they just run that, and now they didn't publicize it. So you only knew about it and it was a little scaled back. I don't know if yours was, but they would scale back in certain elements, maybe not the full band, maybe not all of the transitions. Yours was full on.
Yep, it was. Ours was full.
Which is great. And our church, one of the ones we just helped plant this fall, they're doing that right now. They've got their volunteer service going. They have a good number of volunteers, so it's probably 60 people or something.
Oh, that's great.
And then they have their regular service, the public one. And when they go to 2 publicly, it'll be real easy because it's like, okay, just stop calling it that. Put it on the website.
Yep.
You know, don't pretend like you know everyone. You know, make it seem normal for guests. And so I'm with you there. That is a big thing. I even think that's one of the funny thing is sometimes leadership pushes against that. It's one of the fastest ways to grow your church too.
I agree. I totally agree.
Which is funny. They push against it because probably because they don't want to have 2 churches, which isn't real anyway. But I've heard that complaint. In reality, they would be on board if they realized how much you could grow your church and reach more people.
Right.
So,
right, for sure, 100%.
Any other barriers? One service, vision, recruiting to need rather than vision?
It's been confidence as well. I think confidence has been a barrier for some. And so one of the things that we talk about with leaders is we talk about turning volunteers from renters into owners, which is one of the big things in the books that if you've read the books, you know about. And if you haven't, you should, because it's just this concept that is so simple yet transformative for how you view how volunteers view the way they serve. Regardless of that, one of the things that we talk about with our people who are in the coaching groups is when you are talking about turning renters into owners is to ask for what you really need. And a lot of people are very scared to ask for what they really need because they're just trying to get a little squirrel to come over to them here. So they're very timid. They're like, well, you could serve once a month. Could you serve maybe every other month? Do you want it maybe every other week? And we've just encouraged them to be bold. We've just encouraged them to continually be bold and to, ask for what you really need and, put that out there. And I think that has helped people kind of go, okay, even if someone says no, even if they can't, even if they work, even if they can't do this, that we can help them, or we can find another place for them. But we need to be bold and ask for what we really need, especially if we're trying to develop a relational model.
True. Yeah, that would be a barrier. Because if you keep saying yes to to the smaller commitment, well, then you never get what you need. Yeah. And
exactly.
So the barrier just continues on. How about, so somebody, they're in the group for 10 weeks, which is a short time, obviously, but you're talking about a lot of stuff. Are there changes you see in people, from week 1 to week 10 that they're making throughout the group?
Oh, absolutely. And what we say to leaders is, especially when we start, we kind of say, hey guys, so the next 10 weeks, because we give a handout every week that goes along with the content. So they have, blanks to fill in and they keep those in a binder and all that kind of stuff. But we just kind of say, hey, as we start, let us just tell you the next 10 weeks are going to be like taking a drink out of a fire hose. It's going to be very much. It's going to be a lot. And so don't think that you're going to be able to implement all these things at once. But what we encourage leaders to do is to kind of make a list of a priority of what they'd like to do when and some things that they'd like to accomplish. And what we see is by the end of the 10 weeks, leaders are starting to implement some of those things already, even if it's a coaching structure, even if it's an owners and renters training or whatever their to-do list looks like. We see them beginning that and beginning to even have some confidence in what they're doing or make some transitions, as we've mentioned, in their life. So there is definite change and growth in leaders from one point to the next throughout this group that we've seen, which has been really inspirational.
That's good. So what about anything else, that you've learned from the group? Obviously, there's a lot in the books. Everybody needs to read the books. I agree. But from the group, is there anything else you've learned that as leaders have wrestled with this that would help people listening now as it relates to recruiting and leading volunteers?
Yeah, actually, there's one specific thing. It's one of the weeks that we do. And other than people resonating with the coaching structure, it's this, that a lot of people, one of the weeks that we spend an entire session on is wrong fits and what to do. And a lot of people have not addressed their wrong fits in volunteering. And it's been astonishing to me because almost every person who's gone through our sessions is going, yeah, I got at least one, maybe 50 in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And I need to fix this right now. And so we kind of take them through a step-by-step process of what to do and how to do it. And it's been mind-blowing how many people are afraid to have those conversations, but I understand why. Because hearts are tender, and this is a volunteer, and people are, just trying to serve with their best of intentions at heart. And at the end of the day, while that's true, it's only going to harm your ministry in the long run if you don't deal with it. And so we walk through a complete process of kind of what to do with wrong fits, how to address that on the front end, how to have those conversations over time, how to do it in love. And that has been one of the things that I didn't expect to see as much of as I am. And it's been something that I think has been so important that Sue and I are going to consistently write about that, because it's just necessary in what we do. So.
Yeah, it's true. You don't hear about that a lot. It's not like it's written a lot in books. It's not. I mean, maybe in the business world, because where it's a little more harsh.
It's a little more harsh because dollars are on the line. But with volunteers, they're like, oh, well, and we start by saying this, and they wouldn't let me put this in the book, but this isn't the book, so I'll say it now. If there's a volunteer and you use the phrase "bless their heart" to describe them, they're probably in the wrong place.
Yep. Yeah. True.
And we have to address that, because there's a lot on the line here. This is not something that is just Candyland. This is faith. This is real stuff. And so those of us who lead volunteers, we have to take it seriously, and we have to be able to address those wrong fits and what to do with them. So I think that's been an important thing for me.
Yeah. Well, I love that you're doing it. I think it's consistently, anything with volunteers is consistently a top 2 or 3 challenge for most ministry leaders.
Yeah.
And when you dive into like what volunteering looks like across the church landscape, sometimes it's not as bad as like that 20-80, 80-20 rule, like 20% do 80% of the work, but it's usually really close. You know what I mean?
It's usually close.
30.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it might be 30, do 70 or whatever. And that's just so hard for churches. And so I think what you're doing is great. When's the next coaching group, and like how do people sign up? How does that all work?
Great question. So our next group starts January 17th. So we're about to wrap one up right now. We are recording this in November. I don't know when this will air, but I'm sure it will air sometime soon. We are starting January 17th through March 21st. You can find us at notnormalbook.com. That's notnormalbook.com. And if you just click the coaching tab up at the top, you'll find out all the information that goes into the coaching group and all of our weeks in terms of what the content looks like, how to sign up, all that kind of stuff. And if you can't find that link or whatever, you can, or if you don't see that at the top, there's a glitch or something, it's notnormalbook.com/coaching. And you'll find all the information you need. And we'd love to have you. And really, at the end of the day, we did this just to lean into leaders who lead volunteers, because we just are passionate about them. And that's what we've done throughout our entire careers. So we're fired up and ready to roll.
That's great. I know some people, the cost is $1,000, correct?
It is.
And for some people, that's a barrier. Now, anybody listening to this podcast knows what I think about this, because I do mastermind groups. I've been a part of groups like that where you pay a lot more. I paid much more than that to be a part of 2 different coaching groups with Tony Morgan. You may be familiar with Tony. And they weren't even family ministry specific. I was in 2 groups with mostly executive and lead pastors, and boy, they were so helpful. And like, it's easy to look at the money and think, oh, I don't know, that's a lot, or whatever it might be. You spend, sometimes that's what you spend to go to a conference, once you add it all up. You know what I mean? So I just want to make the case for how important it is, how much it can change your ministry. I mean, you have people coming out of these groups, like you said, who've made these changes, are going to keep implementing stuff. And you would look back like I do at the money I've spent and say, oh, it's totally worth it. Like, and I will do it again. Like, I'll totally do it again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I just want to say that too.
What we did, and I appreciate that, Nick, one of the things that me and Sue did when we started this is we looked at every other coaching program that was out there, and we went cheaper. Not because we wanted to devalue ourselves, but because we believed in leaders and we wanted to make it affordable. And as much as that's my heart, if you know Sue Miller at all, she would never charge anything to do anything. She would just do everything for free. And we just know that, that's not life. And so, but that's just her heart. And so that's why we did what we did. But I appreciate that.
Yeah. And the other part too is you're paying, like, people have that one-on-one access with you all.
Yeah.
That's a separate thing that some people will offer that's not cheap either. So when you get the teaching the content and the weekly and the one-on-one, I mean, that's why it is that price. And I understand it's not going to be for everybody, but it's working. You've had 60 people or almost 60 people take it, which is great. I just always like to remind, I listen to I was listening to Carrie's podcast a few weeks ago, and I think it was Henry Cloud talked about how much in the business world is spent on staff development or personal development, leadership development. Yeah. And like the best companies spend the most money there. I mean, it's just you invest in yourself. And in the ministry world, it is funny how absent that is once people get out of maybe seminary, if they do that. After that, it's like, I might go to a conference. I might read some books. You know what I mean? But there's not a lot of investment in leadership development. But when I talk to churches that are doing a great job, it's evident. It is there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Anyway,
well, thank you. I appreciate
can't make
that.
Case enough. It's been helpful for me. I'm glad you all are doing this because I think it's huge. The books are great. The coaching, I'm sure, is. I know a guy who was in one of your groups, and he was telling me just how great it was. In fact, it might have been the last one, maybe it was one before, Greg. And
for sure.
And so he was telling me just how great the group has been and all of that. So I definitely encourage people to check it out. How can people connect with you if they have any other questions or any other thoughts other than the coaching?
Yeah, great. On our website, as I mentioned, notnormalbook.com, there's a contact us link. You can just click that and emails go right to us directly and we respond in fairly short order. Or on Facebook, find us. Both Sue and I are there and have, just send us a friend request. We'd love to connect, send us a message, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. We'd love to talk all things volunteering.
Definitely. All right. Well, Adam, thanks for coming on the podcast and talking about this with us. I hope people will come and sign up for coaching in January. You'll continue to offer it, obviously. So,
thanks, Nick.
Catch it another time if not, but in January, that'd be great. Thanks for spending the time.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for having me on. Have an awesome day.
Lots of good insights there from Adam, right? I mean, some of those you probably hadn't thought about before. Maybe some of them hit you hard. You're like, you know what? That's me. And I know if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've heard me bang the drum for the importance of investing in yourself with coaching, with leadership, getting in groups, whatever it might be. And it's not just because I help coordinate them or do them. It's because I've been in them and they're very, very helpful. I can't even, put a value to how helpful they've been to me or even point to all the ways that it's helped me in my ministry. If you did listen to that interview with Carey Nieuwhof, he even mentioned that as well. Spent good money to go to a conference, him and his wife, and it changed everything for them. If you haven't listened to that podcast interview, I highly recommend it. That was a great one with Dr. Henry Cloud. It was just on recently. You'll be able to find that in the podcast there, in Carey's podcast there. It was really helpful. So here are some action items I had coming out of that interview. One is to get the books. So if you don't have those two books, Not Normal and Leading Not Normal Volunteers, get them, read them. Like I mentioned, I know a lot of people who are using them in training and onboarding processes. I think you should do that. Get that into your culture as well. Another action item is to consider the January group. Obviously, it is a big investment, but maybe that's what you need. That's the best fit for you. And maybe it means not going to a conference or, not doing this or that. Maybe it means talking to your leadership and saying, hey, we're not going to do this event this year to invest in you here. I know that's a big request, but man, could it make a huge difference? So that group's coming up in January. You can register or apply for that now. And all of that and everything is in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 79. I do think, and a couple other action items, one is to decide if you're in the right spot. Maybe you're one of the people like Adam was talking about that have been in the group that it's just not a good situation. It's very dysfunctional. And you may need to think, is this where I need to be right now? Is this where God's going to use me best? That's probably the way I frame it up. Is this where God has called me to be? The another action item is to lead with vision. He talked about how so many people lead with need. How can you lead and recruit with vision this coming week? What does it look like? Is there somebody you're talking to about volunteering? Is there somebody you can talk to in the lobby that you've never met? And you're in your mind, you're going to say, I'm going to lead with vision. Another action item that's much more difficult, you're not going to do this in a week or whatever, is start a coaching structure. If you don't have that, like Adam talked about, a lot of people are responding to that. That's because it's incredibly helpful. Without that, there's definitely a lid to the growth in your ministry. So I would encourage you to start that, learn about it, ask questions. Maybe you're going to jump in their group in January and, work on it that way. Whatever it takes. There's lots of episodes that on this podcast where we've talked about that. I've also written a number of posts about it on the blog. Dive into it and start to develop that for your ministry. It'd be really, really helpful. So again, the show notes are nickblevins.com/episode 79. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.